So yesterday, as we were looking at Deuteronomy 6, and we were looking at the blessing that God has promised, and how we need to kind of take that and instill that into our children, into our family, and into the next gen. We also kind of hit and highlighted Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, which is, if you'll remember from from your studies of the Gospels, Jesus says the greatest of the commandments is this verse, Shema, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, with all your strength. And so yesterday, as we were talking about this, I indicated, I just sort of touched on this verse and what this meant. I wanted to dive a little deeper with you on this one today because it is an incredibly interesting and powerful verse that seems to summarize all of the law. Because in Deuteronomy chapter 5, as we mentioned yesterday, Moses has just finished completely retelling the story and retelling the law, the Ten Commandments, and now he gets into this part where he talks about how God's commands are blessing for us, and then he gives us this command: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. And Jesus, when he was challenged with the law, he pointed to this verse, the Shema. It's an important verse, an important part of Jewish history and Jewish tradition, because every morning and every evening, Jews would wake up and get ready for bed, and they would say the Shema, this prayer. And it's very important. And there are two main verbs in this, and I wanted to kind of dive into both of those very briefly with you this morning. Here is the Hebrew word Shema. It's an interesting word because it carries with it a variety of meaning. It can literally mean hear, like you have audio hitting into your eardrum and you're hearing it, like God has created ears for hearing. But it also can mean things like pay attention or focus on, or respond to, like if you hear a baby crying and it's Shema here, I hear it and I'm responding to this baby. But what's interesting about this word is it also carries with it action. It's not just hearing something. The expectation of hear, O Israel, Shema, the expectation is that there's action that follows. Matter of fact, here's the thing that I thought was most interesting about this verse and this word. In Hebrew, there is not a word for obey. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. In Hebrew, there is not a word for obey. When they want to kind of communicate the idea of obedience, in Hebrew, they would simply use the word Shema, listen. Because the implication is that if you are listening, you're hearing, then you will do what you've been told to do. You see this play out in the commands in Exodus and Deuteronomy and Leviticus when God is telling the people to hear. He uses the word Shema, Shema, Shema. Hear very closely and do what you've been called and commanded to do. Very important word, because the idea of hearing is the idea of obeying. And I think that's an important concept as we begin to think through Scripture and how that applies to our life, because if we hear it and we don't obey, we're like what the prophets would say to the Israel as they were kind of abandoning God. They said they hear, but they're not doing. So we need to be hearers of the word, as James says, but not just hearers of the word, but doers also. The second word in this passage, the second verb in this verse, Deuteronomy 6:4, is the word love. There are a lot of different words that could be used to describe love in the Hebrew Scriptures, in the Old Testament. This one is an interesting one because it has a variety of connections to it in terms of how it can be used. It can be used, for example, of someone who has affection for another person, who wants to care for them. So, for example, a mother and a child can have this kind of love described to them. Matter of fact, this word is used to describe the love that Abraham has for Isaac. This word is used to describe the kind of love that Jonathan and David had, that David had with Jonathan. This sort of deep affection for someone. It does carry with it this idea of a feeling, like I feel love for you. But it's not limited to just a feeling or an emotion. It carries with it the idea of action. This love is a love that is always going to drive the person to do something for the recipient, for the person whom they have affection for. And so when we look at this verse, what we're seeing here is an opportunity for us as humans, as individuals who are living under the law, and living under a grace and living according to God's commands, to demonstrate to others the kind of love that God has for us. Because this is a word that is oftentimes used to describe God's love for his people. He has a deep affection for us, and it is a kind of love that is unconditional. It's a kind of love that's not dependent upon someone else's involvement. It is a love that is driven by his character, in terms of who he is and what he does. And it's the same word here that we are to love God in this same way. And so it is demonstrated through obedience, Shema, and it is demonstrated by what we do. I think if you look in sort of the New Testament kind of carries with this idea, the book of James carries this idea very well, that if we say we have faith but we don't have works, then our faith is really useless. And this is the idea of this word love in Deuteronomy 6:4, to love the Lord your God with everything that you are, so that it is impacting other people. And so as you go about your day and as you begin to kind of take some of the things we talked about yesterday and put them into practice, I want you to be mindful of these two verbs, these two words in Deuteronomy 6:4. Listen, hear, which means to obey. When we hear God speak, we see God's words communicated in the scriptures, that we are to obey. But then we also are to love the Lord our God, which is communicated this idea of devotion and obedience to what God has called us to do and how he has called us to live. So I encourage you, as you go about your day to day, that you live the life that God has called you to live in a manner that is worthy of the calling, because we are his children, and we are to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, with all of our soul, with all our might, and with all our strength.